Week 17 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first guy, Cameron Dicker of Los Angeles Chargers. So Cameron Dicker available right now, 53% of fantasy leagues. He's been one of the best kickers in terms of putting it through the uprights this season. Him and Brandon Aubrey both haven't missed a field goal this year. So Dicker, one of the best games of his career, had 20 fantasy points in Week 16. I know this offense really hasn't scored a lot for this Los Angeles Charger team the last few weeks, but Dicker's got a good boot. He got opportunity last week, and he made the most of it. So this week with a good matchup at the Denver Broncos, middle of the pack, giving up the 16th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. A bend but don't break type of defense over the last month of the season. I think Dick is a kicker that can help fantasy owners, and he's definitely someone to pick up, available in 53% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Chase McLaughlin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mentioned McLaughlin a lot this season on the list, and he's still out there in 98% of fantasy leagues. So the last 3 weeks, double-digit fantasy points each game for McLaughlin. Week 14 at Atlanta, 11. Week 15 at the Green Bay Packers, 11. And Week 16 versus the Jaguars, 13. So Week 17, another home game and a good matchup versus the New Orleans Saints. A bend but don't break defense for the most part this season. That gives up the 17th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right now, this Tampa Bay offense hitting on all cylinders. They're getting in the red zone, and they're not finishing most of the drives off in the red zone, but Chase McLaughlin's going out there and getting at least 2 or 3 opportunities weekly. So once again, Chase McLaughlin has a good matchup coming up and available in 98% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Greg Zuerlein of the New York Jets. He's accounted for 50% of the Jets scoring this season. I know there's some weeks where he hasn't done anything, where this Jet team can't even get in the red zone at all. And then there's some weeks where he's had double-digit fantasy points. So right now, Week 17, a matchup with the Cleveland Browns on paper I know isn't great. They give up the second least amount of fantasy points to kickers on the season. But like I said, Greg Zuerlein's 50% of this offense, and it is a bend but don't break defense of the Cleveland Browns, where I think opportunities could be there for Greg the Leg. So the last few weeks, Week 14 versus Houston, 17. Then Week 15 in Miami, the Jets got shut out, so he had 0. And Week 16 versus the Commanders, 12. So this week, if you need a kicker in deeper leagues, or you think Zuerlein could be a good streaming option, he's available in 93% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Cairo Santos of the Chicago Bears. So Cairo Santos, he locked up a nice extension, 4 years, $16 million a few days ago. And he just goes out there and he's been putting up fantasy points for the most part over the last month of the season. Week 12 in Minnesota, 13. Week 14 versus Detroit, 7. Week 15 in Cleveland, 6. And Week 16 versus the Cardinals, 9. So this week, a good matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So Santos, he's been a good kicker many seasons for this Bear team. Obviously, he's not really recognized in fantasy much. Available in 93% of fantasy leagues. And a guy who just goes out there and puts it through the upright. So with this Bear offense stalling out a lot this year, but they've been playing better at home than they've been on the road. This week versus Atlanta, that's been but don't break as well. Gives up the 3rd most points to kickers. I like Santos as an ad this week. 5th and final kick I looked at off the wire this week, Lucas Havrisik of the Los Angeles Rams. So the Rams this season, they've definitely had trouble at kicker. Early in the year, Brett Maher got off to a good start, and then once again, he couldn't find the uprights, missing field goals. And then Havrisik, they got in the lineup since Week 8 here is this Los Angeles Ram team. But the last few weeks, he's gone out there and put up points. Week 14 at Baltimore, 12. Week 15 versus the Commanders, 6. And then last week versus New Orleans, 10 fantasy points. So this week here, a good matchup at the New York Giants. A defense that's been bent but don't break over the last few weeks here. And a defense that's vulnerable to giving up points. So Havrisik, he's gone out there and he's starting to get the football through the uprights. He's been more consistent. I know he missed a few field goals a few weeks ago, but this week at the New York Giants, definitely the winds could be howling, and that could be a problem over there in MetLife Stadium. But I think Havrisik in the afternoon game could have a decent game. And like I said, this Ram offense has been high-powered over the last month of the season. And he's available as Havrisik in 96% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few kickers I looked at off the wire in a crucial Week 17 of the fantasy football season.